Hello, everybody. Warm welcome to an just additional webinar as part of the Foresight Erasmus Plus series. So as you know, Foresight is about technological competencies, looking into the future, and also to think through what are maybe skills managers, business people need to have in the future. And we think that digital product design is one important thing as of that. And in this regards, I'm super happy, super proud to have David Lehmann with me, who is conducting a series of digital product design seminars and workshops in various business schools in Oxford and in ESCP. And David will enlighten us a little bit in how he's doing it and maybe sharing with us the important facts, what managers should know about digital product design. So thank you very much for joining, and in particular, thank you very much, David, for your time and being with us. And so as you already started presenting, I will just hand over to you, and the floor is yours, David. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Markus. I'm really delighted to be here and to be part of this Erasmus Plus session today. My name is David Lehmann, as Markus mentioned already. I'm a visiting lecturer at ESCP, and I do teach a lot of different digital innovation, digital product design classes with the ESCP. In a former life, before coming back to university, I ran a digital communications agency, and so many of the topics, the practice learnings that I had here, I could transfer into my teaching at ESCP. A bit of expectation management. The session is called Digital Product Design, what managers should know. We just have 1 hour, right? So I do teach these contents in different kind of formats, and this will be quite a wild ride in this 1 hour. So bear with me, it's quite dense and compressed. If you want to have like further references, I have some videos linked. Maybe you want to go back some slides and stop the video to look at what we're looking at, because I might go a bit more quickly over the one or other topic because of the time constraint.
But so maybe David, before so if you need 5-10 minutes more, we are not in a rush. So the 1 hour is a time frame, but if you need 5-10-15 minutes more, all good. Thank you.
Very, very good. So why do we think about digital product designers in the first place at the business school, right? One could argue, okay, business managers, they should mostly be able to run accounting, they should be good leaders, they maybe should have their information systems under control. I think that's something that Markus is very much interested in. But why should they care about design, right? And why digital product design? And I have a bit of a humorous slide to answer this question quite directly, which is this one, right? So if you think about digital products, you might have a lot of misunderstandings because of their complexity. And this is what this cartoon refers to. So the first picture is how the customer explained it, then how the product leader understood it, how the analysts designed it, what operations installed, how it was documented, how it was supported, how the business consultants described it, how the programmer wrote it, what the beta testers received, what marketing advertised, what the customer really needed, and how it performed under load. And I mean, there's more than just design in this question, but there are a lot of issues around designing digital products, software, for example, it can, obviously software, but it can also include different kind of hardware components in a digital product. If we think, for example, in trade fairs, if we have like exhibition spaces that are digitally designed or so on. But I think one of the key problems is the complexity of software and the way that we talk about requirements, that we talk about what we want, how we want it, and so on. And then we have all these different roles involved in a business. And if we don't have artifacts to refer to and to agree on certain issues, then we will have a lot of problems, as this cartoon illustrates. But now you might ask, what is design actually in the first place? And why do we think now, like coming from information systems, than talking about, okay, all these communications, like, why design? What is design about? And there's this man, you probably know him, Steve Jobs, the former CEO of Apple, that passed away a couple of years ago. And he said design is not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works. So design is really the structure, the concept. It's not just the surface layer of colors or typography, or how something, if you have a tactile interface, how something feels. It is the entire engineering underneath, right? And that's important to understand when we think about design. From a business perspective, I think it's important to also understand that design helps us to understand what customers actually want, and what is actually possible, right? And then we connect that with what is like viable, what is like doable in a business model, what can we operate, which competencies do we have as an organization to run these things. And then again, it is important to understand that we cannot just create software or like little artifacts like jewelry or other things. We can design bigger or larger scale systems as well, right? So design is a multi-layered phenomenon. And so you can design objects, you can design services, and you can design entire systems, right? And the complexity of this pyramid, as you can see here in this slide, increases obviously as well. If you want, for example, to design public infrastructure, right? And obviously there's a lot more dependencies as if you, I don't know, create a new website or a piece of jewelry. I have one video that I will not show now during the presentation, but I would encourage you to have a look at it. It is a video of the American design firm IDEO. And IDEO is a company that has been leading in product design for many years. The video is a bit older. It's, I think, roughly 15 years old. But what you can see there is how they run through a sort of a design sprint in a very multidisciplinary team with very kind of flat hierarchies. There's someone who facilitates the design process. And they are all not experts. That's quite important. They are experts on the design process. And then they go where the experts are. Where are the users? Who can we ask? And then they tackle the design challenge together. And you might know, for example, design thinking. There are other formats like the Google Design Sprint. And a lot of these kind of methodologies have been introduced to business organizations as well. As I would say, kind of customer requirements have become more complex with time. It became more and more important to understand what the customer needs. So we emphasize, then we define what actually the problem is that we want to solve. We ideate, so we become more creative about what could be potential solutions to the problem. We build prototypes, sometimes even very kind of low fidelity prototypes, and then we test and iterate, right? So we learn empirically from building prototypes. This slide illustrates there's a lot of variety in the kind of naming of the different phases, but in the end, it's essentially a similar process. So design already plays a huge role in organizations, and especially kind of design thinking as like kind of a standardized approach of design by non-designers in business organizations. It has already been a big thing I would say for the last decade. And now we talk about digital product design. Why is that? Obviously, more and more organizations become service oriented. Less and less companies actually sell products, or if they sell products, more and more companies have the requirement that there is a service attached to it, right? Think of the car industry. It's not every car that is being sold is now car sharing, but what you see is that more and more cars that get sold are attached to digital services that enrich the customer experience and help with aspects like maintenance and so forth. So digital software or digital products have become more and more important. And we have seen that design has become more and more important to understand kind of the customer problems. And now we look at, okay, what area does all this cover? Right? And if we look here in kind of the interaction design world, and we see, okay, there's actually a lot of fields involved. There's like usability engineering, where we think about who can actually use this product. Have we do like visually or hearing impaired people that might struggle with certain interfaces? So we want to have the kind of human machine interaction well done. We want to think about kind of what the kind of scenarios are. Do we have like media installations in a room? And so what are the contexts? So there's a lot of different kind of disciplines or sub-disciplines involved in what we want to do, right? And the larger field of user experience design, which is essentially digital product design, neighbors or overlaps with a lot of other disciplines, such as human factors and ergonomics, industrial design. If you do something in the room with architecture, certainly with information architecture and computer science as well. All right, so really this multidisciplinary approach, which again highlights the need for communication and transfer of information between the involved parties of these complex products. All right, I already mentioned design thinking. You probably also have heard about the lean startup, where you have these build, measure, learn cycles, where you quickly iterate from a business perspective. And I think it's important to understand that all these aspects are integrated into each other in modern companies, right? You have sort of design thinking to understand problems. Then you have the lean startup to quickly iterate your product, to run tests, and you deliver on that through like agile software development, right? So these different buzzwords, as we often call them, they sort of run integratedly in modern organizations. And underlying, under all these kind of issues, design thinking, lean startup, and agile, is the question of digital product design if we build software, because we want to communicate and we want to agree on what we are actually building, right? So for this reason, it's an essential skill for today's business managers to be able to communicate about these things, to have the right vocabulary and understand the processes and also the tasks involved in building these products. That as an introduction. I would now go and cover a bit of design basics, right? So we understand where we are, like what design really is and where it comes from. And then we dig a bit deeper into the digital part. So when we think about design, I think obviously objects have been designed for as long as humans exist. You might know all these like cave drawings and all these kind of things, or obviously architecture, Roman temples, and so on. I will start with, because we are obviously talking in digital product design, mostly about digital interfaces. I will start from books. And in books, I'm not sure if you're aware of, if you open a book usually has a certain structure, right? You see there's a headline, there are columns, there's a certain spacing, and it's sort of symmetric, but it's also different for the left and for the right side. Here you see there's illustrations that sort of break the rigid structure. And this is a Bible, for example. And you see how typography, the letters, how color has been used to highlight certain things, like the headlines. There's like a small page number on the top right side. And so there seems to be some sort of structure to this page, right? And I mean, this is like an old book. And even back in the day, there was a system behind that. Here I illustrate that this is a grid. We call this a grid that geometrically explains the structure of the book design. And this book design is like, or this way of designing artifacts like the book is still valid today. If we look at modern ads like this one, here we see like it looks like a news, like a magazine page or 2 pages. On the left-hand side, we have the Maiden Tower with the headline in Istanbul, and on the right-hand side, we have these kind of 2-column text with different elements. We have a big headline, we have smaller sub-headlines. Then if we think back about the grid of the Bible, we can see we can also apply this grid exactly like it was to this page, and it also works, right? You see that the Maiden Tower is perfectly centered under the headline, and it sort of is at the end of this box that you see there. And this same box works on the other side and has been divided into 2 columns. And so there seem to be sort of principles or rules that you can follow to make design work, right? And the reasons why they work, we will not be able to get too deep into it, but just take away that there are these rules that, for example, these grids, certain ways of highlighting aspects, for example, through larger fonts or different fonts, through the use of color to highlight certain aspects. They use like symmetry, they use contrast and so on to make these things work. So in design, we have usually sort of principles that we can apply to make something work. So design is not necessarily an art. It is mostly a craft, right? So we can build on principles that we can learn, that we can apply, for example, here to books, to magazines, but then also to digital products, right? And obviously this course or this session today is not suited to make anyone an expert in design, but it should help us understand the whole lingo and processes behind it. So let's have a look at what is actually different from designing books or magazines when we go to digital products, and why is it important to understand that? So first of all, actually it's quite similar. So grid, typography, colors, they are all there, right? We have all these aspects as well that we have to look at, but they are sort of different, right? Where we had this grid that was dictated by the physical artifact and like the fact that we hold our hands left and right of the book. For example, the margins on the left and the right were much larger than in the center of the book, right? We don't have that necessarily in kind of digital products. And so what we see here is we have way more symmetrical grids. We have different kind of fonts because they work better on displays, etc., etc. We also have questions of different displays. So for example, many of the kind of column layouts that you see in web design are designed in a way that they are responsive, that they can adjust to different kind of screen sizes, right? And so while kind of the basic principles remain in place, you need to understand that the kind of context, the medium that you're designing for is quite important, and it has its own constraints, such as resolution of the display, right? And then obviously that certain like fonts are more appropriate than others, and also that you obviously don't know what your customer will use in most cases as a display, what kind of hardware and operating system will be in place. You probably don't even know the browser, for example, that your system will be running on. This is just a different example here from the BBC. You see, most, if you look at a random website, most will follow these kind of grid structures. usually like 12 columns. This, it really depends a bit on the framework that I use. Then the second thing that is different is the use of layers, right? Where we have a book, everything's on one layer. We have a magazine, everything's printed either digitally or in offset or through other technologies. In digital, we can suddenly use multiple layers and, for example, animate things, so there might be movement involved. We have a bigger toolkit, so to say, to make things happen in a relatively easy way. This illustration here of the BBC is referring to the way that Disney was animating the kind of first cartoon movies. So because they had the requirement of animating a lot of frames, they didn't want to redraw the background over and over and over again. And for example, they could do parallax scrolling with these kind of different plates. And so they would only redraw the figures over and over to animate these. And in digital, we can do that way more easily. We have a lot of digital tools at hand for that. And we can obviously also reuse digital assets in a way that was not possible with analog beforehand. I already mentioned digital tools. This is just an overview. This is obviously not complete. There are a lot of tools that you can use to do digital product design, especially when it comes to building the kind of structures that you want to show. There's, for example, Adobe XD and Vision Studio. There's Sketch and Figma. They all have different pricing models or business models. So maybe have a look at a variety or multiple and then see what can be helpful for you. Or if you want to maybe not use any at all, and you want to draw everything by hand, which is also perfectly possible. All right, now we talked about, okay, these kind of principles that are there in design. And obviously, if you talk about a kind of surface level design, you want to have it everything redefined, refined on a kind of surface design, color, typography, etc. You want to have someone who's a professional, right? And usually we have two specialists in place, or two groups of digital product design specialists. And these are the user experience people and the user interface people. Why the difference between them? I always like to highlight the different kind of education that they have on average. Whereas a user interface person will probably have a visual design background. So they are visual designers specialized in designing digital interfaces. So they are concerned with colors, typography, layout, etc. The user experience person will potentially have a psychology background, might have a business background or organizational studies background, and is really more concerned with building the structures, the concepts behind it, and not the kind of surface layer. So they will be more concerned with scenarios and user research, with information architecture, and prototyping and interaction and testing, right? And they work hand in hand, obviously. And the contents that we'll cover today, they are definitely more on the kind of user experience side, where we as business people, we can have a role and talk to the UX and UI people about how we imagine the software to work, and then obviously bring in other stakeholders as well. Important to understand is that in most organizational contexts, if you're not a startup and you don't have anything yet, in most organizational contexts, you have requirements of the organization, how things have to be designed, right? We can think of, for example, what you had already, I don't know, 30 years ago, where you had like brand manuals that define colors and icons and how the brand is being used, etc. Right? Just like the background that Markus has with the ESCP colors and the ESCP logo, the predefined kind of headline color, etc. This would all be in this kind of standard style guide or brand manual. Nowadays, we also have component libraries for digital product design. That means that we have predefined elements that we can use, that we can basically reassemble to build our interfaces, right? And then these two aspects are embedded in design systems. More standards, for example, how we use language, how we use motion, how the information architecture should look like, etc., etc. So if you're not a startup, you are in an organizational context, I would encourage you to think and to reach out to the people that are responsible for maintaining the design system of the organization and see what kind of requirements they have that need to be incorporated for digital product design. So it's important, an important kind of quality management issue, because otherwise, if you're disregarding that, you might have a lot of trouble adjusting that later on. When we think of digital product design more in the sense of not just building software, but also using, I would say, native apps, then we have basically two big ecosystems these days. We have the Mac, Apple ecosystem, and we have the Google Android ecosystem. And I think it's important to understand that because of the pairing of the operating system of Apple with the hardware of Apple, that is a different setup than the Google Android world, which is an open source operating system that is not connected directly to any type of hardware, right? So, for example, Samsung or Huawei, they offer devices, and they all run Android. And both have entirely different software ecosystems. That means the way that their app stores, for example, work, the way that they review software that you submit to these app stores is entirely different. They have entirely different guidelines. So a lot of software, like from teams that submit for the first time to these stores, get actually rejected because they do not follow one or the other standard that is being set in these app stores. So I encourage you to look at, they have design guidelines in terms of how the interfaces should look like in both kind of ecosystems, but there's also a lot of content regulation there. What kind of digital products can you build and publish in which of these two worlds? As a rule of thumb, the Apple ecosystem is way more restrictive. They have a much higher quality control, and they reject way more submissions. And so I think probably in most cases, depending on the customer target group that you have, you will potentially want to submit to both app stores. So you might need to look into both requirements. I already mentioned that especially for Android, there's a huge fragmentation of the kind of devices, right? So this is like an older illustration already. That's probably not the latest mobile phone, so it will only have become worse. You see that there are a lot of devices out there, and they have different kind of combinations of software versions of operating systems and hardware. And when I say hardware, I mean the displays, I mean the software, I mean the way that they potentially have keyboards or not have keyboards, what kind of sensors they have, etc., etc. So that's really a tough exercise for us to design for all of these, and that includes also usually some sort of business decision making, which with the kind of limited resources that we have, which devices, which software versions are we actually able to cover? And where do we stop supporting certain devices and screen resolutions, etc. So that's probably one of the trade-offs that you will have to make when designing something. Something else that is very important to understand is like, how is a website different from an app? And you see already by looking at these kind of two screenshots, they sort of seem different. And on the right-hand side, when I have a website, I sort of see these kind of URL on the top, and I have some other user interface elements that don't seem to be part of my particular offering. And this is because websites run in a software that is called browser, and they are based on web technology, whereas apps directly run on the operating system. That means when you use a website, you're basically one step more away from the hardware than as if you run an app directly on the operating system. And that has a lot of implications that potentially can mean that your solution is going to run slower on a browser because there's just more translation work happening in between the operating system and your software, and that you have restricted access to the resources that are the kind of features that your hardware provides. And you're sort of locked into this browser window, right, where you have this URL on top, etc. Now there's a hybrid version of that. There are some apps who look like native apps, but in reality they are rendered through web technology, and they don't see a browser bar and so on. So then you combine some of the advantages of a normal app, for example, having it on your home screen, with a kind of advantages of the web technology, where you find easily engineers, for example, a lot of people can build web apps, not so many can build native apps, and it's obviously also easier to submit to two different ecosystems like Google Android and the iOS ecosystem. However, you still have the constraints on the kind of hardware side. And here I have a little overview of that issue. So if you want to, for example, you want to use the accelerometer or Bluetooth of the hardware that the software is running on, then you have no chance other than using a native app, and you cannot do that through the browser. Some features like geolocation, for example, you might know that from your browser when you call like a website with a map, and then it asks you whether or not you want to share your location details. This is possible already in the browser, also the use of a microphone. But a lot of the features that you might want to have are actually only realizable through native apps. Then again, we have actually quite a huge variety, even if we only think, we don't think about desktops, we don't think about all the kind of, I don't know, washing machines and other devices that nowadays are running operating systems. We only think in kind of, oh, for example, what software, what hardware runs iOS? And these days, it's watches, it's phones, it's tablets, it's cars, it's smart TVs, etc. Right? So bear in mind that you might want to develop for a relatively narrow set of devices, or you might want to say, okay, it's important for the solution that I develop that it also runs on cars, right? And people that are currently traveling, they connect their phone to the car, and then it needs to look good on their car display, right? And all this obviously brings additional costs and development time, and obviously considerations that you have to make when working on the digital product design on the kind of concept side. Then I would like to highlight two further issues. These are two separate problems that you need to consider. First of all, the adoption rate of new operating system versions is different in the two different worlds, right? So iOS and Android. In the Android world, you can see on the right-hand side that a lot, and these are not the latest versions, but basically the image, the picture, the overall picture is not changed. The adoption rates are relatively low, right? That means you will need to deal not only with different types of hardware, as I showed you in the kind of device fragmentation. Now you will also need to deal with different versions of operating systems. And yeah, there again, you will need to make a decision on which operating systems will we support, right? On the left-hand side, we do see, again, that there is a pairing between software and hardware. And for certain devices, only certain versions of the operating system of Apple iOS are being supported. That means if you decide to cut off, for example, let's say we do not want to support, let's say, iOS 10, that means you will only support iPhone 8, iPhone 8 Plus devices, and you will cut off a certain part of the market. And what you obviously need to do is when you design something, you need to be aware of how large is this piece of the market that you're cutting off in your digital product design, in the kind of decisions that you make, and how important is this part for my business in the end. And then you might just do it, make a trade-off decision there. All right. So we now come to basically the second part of the lecture, where building on what we know now already, we learn about the kind of elements of digital product design, the processes or stages. We know something about that already through design thinking that we heard earlier of, and the tools that we use. You can also call the tools artifacts, right? Something that you create to communicate your digital product design. Let's first go through the 5 layers or elements of digital product design. So those that you want to cover when you want to build such a concept. Imagine you want to build an app for something. What is it that you need to know in order to have a consistent and complete understanding of the app design? And we will cover these 4 out of 5 layers, which are strategy, so the people problem, the business goal, the scope, the features and the requirements, the content requirements. The structure is the interaction design information architecture, and the skeleton, which is the user interface and navigation design. What we will not cover, and what we should leave to the visual designers, the user interface designers, is all the questions around visual design. What kind of colors do we choose? How does the typography work exactly? How do animations work? There we want to have people who are specialists in their field. There, we should leave to the experts, so to say. But the others, we can actually tackle as business people, right? We don't necessarily need to hand this entirely over to user experience expert. Obviously, you want to work with them. If your organization has user experience experts, they do a lot of testing. They have, I'm very sure, a lot of insight into your customer needs and so on. So, but obviously you want to be able to work with them, and you want to be equipped and understanding what they're doing as well. So first of all, we want to have a strategy, right? What does that mean? Why are we building this product? And who are we building it for? What kind of problem do we actually solve, right? So that's the really big picture, right? That's the foundation that we need to make clear in order to go into the right direction together, right? So what are we doing? We want to have a problem that we solve, and we want to tackle some sort of business goal with it as well. And so it's really the reason of being for the product that you define in the strategy, right? And you can just do that. You can obviously involve a lot of kind of desk research. You can do a bit of market research, but you can also do interviews, right? You can talk to people. You can bring in data and show why you're doing it. And always these kind of details, they help, for example, decision makers high up in the hierarchy understand why this is an important thing to build and why you're investing all of these kind of resources and time and effort into building such a digital product. So strategy, very plain and very straightforward. You need to make sure that, like, what is the reason for building this product? Then we have the scope. And the scope is basically sketching out what this digital product should be able to do and what kind of, these are the functional specifications, and also what kind of contents it will require. And the content side is a bit harder to understand sometimes, but let's quickly start with the functions. So in the functional requirements, what you do is you note down every functionality that you want to see, right? In this example, one of the required functionalities is that you are able to make transactions. And there's sort of content connected to that as well. Here's a person, money description. And you make a long list of things that you would like to have. It's basically just a wish list, so to say, right? So you want to think about what you can include, and later on you will find out obviously what is doable and what is not doable with the budget that you have. But first of all, it's what is in the app and what maybe is also not part of the app. So you have a scope, a certain kind of shape of what you want to do. And then we have content requirements. I think content requirements are particularly important in contexts where you deal a lot with content. Think of a museum app, for example. And in a museum, you have a lot of objects on display. And for every object on display, you potentially have a video. Let's say you have some descriptive text, you have some links, and maybe you have not only a video, but also some pictures. And then you have events that might be linked to this object, etc. And suddenly you have a huge amount of these kind of different file types or data types, and you all need to manage them somehow. So you need to understand what kind of different types of content do I actually need to build into my app, but also what is the kind of, like, it's an entirely different thing whether I just display a picture or if I display a video, right? So there might be technological questions connected to that in the background as well that you need to discuss with your information systems experts, the development teams, etc. So there we have the functional requirement, and then we have the content requirements as well that you just need to think about what kind of data types, etc. I want to display in my app or want to incorporate. And now it becomes a bit more, I would say, what you probably expect from design, right? Now, like in the structure of a digital product, you really need to think about the information architecture and how users flow through your app. Information architecture, when we talk about the connected artifacts later or tools later on, will probably become even more clear. But information architecture is really, how is the data structured that you have, right? So, for example, if you have a data set for a person, right, what kind of information do I store regarding each of these persons? And how do persons connect to transactions, right? But also, for example, how does a navigational structure look like? So all these kind of different connections between different types of data, this is the information architecture, right? And obviously you need to make sure that you communicate what kind of data you have, what kind of data you need. And this is obviously also a process where you might want to involve more like technology experts for the infrastructure that is in place already. For example, if you are in a corporate setting, you will have a lot of customer data already that you might be able to use depending on the kind of legal situation already for your app. And then in the interaction design and the user flow, you want to define the steps that users flow through. And my recommendation is always for user flows to basically take screens, think of screens. How do these screens are connected? How are the screens connected to each other? All right, do we have a screen to, I don't know, share something? Do we have a screen to review conversations? Do we have a screen to spend money, like in this context? So the kind of process steps you as a user run through when using the app. And last, we have the skeleton. And the skeleton is really the interface design and the way that information is being transferred to the user, so the information design. So what's interface design? Interface design is basically designing the human-machine interface in a way that like users can see something and they can interact with it. What you might want to do is, if you're interested in user interface design, acquaint yourself with all the kind of different, for example, buttons or lists and interface elements that are there. And what I like, usually it is relatively clever to reuse things that users have learned already, so you don't do it from scratch. You use elements and components that are there already. And especially if you're in a corporate context, you might have a design system in place. You might just be able to pull this out of the drawer and recombine it in a way that you build the kind of software that you want. And finally, it's the information design. It's like how information is provided. That also might include certain like interactions, like alert boxes, the layover, what kind of buttons can users click, etc., etc. So that's very closely connected to the interface design. And then obviously we have the surface layer. This is the one that we are not covering today. And as I said, I recommend for you to leave to the user interface design experts, or it might not always be visual design, could also be, for example, involving music, could involve sound and video, and all of these kind of questions where you need to have a deep expertise in what you're doing there. And here's an example for what would be kind of this surface layer. This is like, okay, what color does the top bar have? If there's like a gain, is that displayed in green or like in red when it's a loss? Is the picture of a user being displayed in a circle or in a square? These are all questions that I would not recommend you to tackle as a person-to-person yourself, but they're obviously also important questions, and this is why they are part of these 5 layers or elements of user experience design. And here's a short recap. From the kind of bottom up, then we have the strategy, the product objectives and user needs. We have the scope, where we have functional requirements and content requirements. We have the structure, the interaction design and information architecture. Then we have the skeleton with information design and interface design. Here they also mention navigation design, which is like basically how things are connected with each other. And then on the top layer, we have this kind of what they call sensory design, anything connected to color, music, motion, etc. That is very kind of concrete. All right. So when we think about the process of running through this, we will see that obviously this is a learning process, right? So if we start doing, and through doing we learn, and we become, also as a group with different stakeholders, we become aligned, right? And so it is totally normal that sort of early stages of such projects are relatively chaotic, and there's a lot of sense making involved. There's a lot of agreeing and certain conventions being involved. What shall the app actually be about? And some parts of the organizations might have a different kind of issue. And as you're building your way from the kind of first layer, the strategy layer, up to the last layer, the top layer, you will learn a lot, and there might be also a lot of iterations involved. And that's totally normal. So like, don't be worried about that when you have like a lot of kind of uncertainty involved in early processes. Through moving forward, you learn and you become, you get more clarity and end up at some point with like a concept, a design that can be put into production. Similarly to like standard design thinking processes, in the beginning, you want to learn about your customers, you want to formulate a point of view based on these insights, you brainstorm what could be potential solutions, you prototype, you test, and go back to kind of forming ideas. Now, as you in digital product design, you are creating a certain artifact, right? You want to have a software. There are more experts involved, right? So they want to, at some point, have a decision. Is this the design? Is this how it shall look like? What kind of data do we want to involve, etc. So, and how does the kind of testing process look like, etc. So there's sort of a later cycle that you might run through as well, which is a bit more might feel a bit more like waterfall than a standard design thinking process. Because at some point you just need to have handoff decisions. Basically, you say, okay, this is how it looks for the next iteration, and then you move forward and test it and so on, usually in the kind of agile software way. All right, so we have this process, we have all these layers, and now we want to think about the tools. And obviously we are trying to cover a lot of content in this session. What we're not going to cover are the kind of standard tools. We are not going in depth into design grids and design principles, or how you do user research, how you capture kind of stakeholder relations, or you build personas that you want to build this app for. We're also not covering kind of ideation techniques like the how might we technique, or things like how to make sure that you're creating value for the customer through value propositions. And we are also not designing kinds of service systems and service blueprints or sketch out user journeys. These are all things that we need to take for granted for now. So if you are not acquainted with these kind of methods, maybe look them up, or these topics. And there's a lot of online material available on the web on each of them, if you want to dig deeper into that. But what we're going to do now is like, we just assume you know these things and you know how to facilitate certain kind of, I would say, workshops. And then now we go into the kind of, okay, what concretely, what does need to stand at the end in my concept? What do I need to create to communicate my idea to a third party? For example, like a decision maker, a customer, an investor, etc. Right? And the first one, after thinking about what could be potential features, why are we building this in the first place? So kind of lower two layers, we want to think of how do we actually structure features into screens? And how do these screens actually are connected with each other, right? So to say, a user flow can be defined as a map of all the screens that you have. So a big overview. And this can start like in this kind of very process oriented way, can become more sophisticated in this kind of, for example, for a website, in this kind of tree structure. And at some point you want to end up with all the screens separately and the kind of ways that you can navigate between them in a large map. I always recommend to start off with empty rectangles, to not have any content in them yet, and just give them a number, a unique identifier, and a name. And then you can start with annotating. You can say, what is happening on these screens? And as you move forward through the design process, if you use digital software, you can just zoom into each of the screens and build them out in a user interface sense. But while you are in this early stage, you might just want to leave this a bit more, I would say, open, and just annotate what shall happen on each of these screens. Then when you're going into wireframing, you actually start drawing the interfaces for each of these screens, right? And when you say wireframe, then I mean an abstract representation. That does not mean a final design. As I said, we're not covering the top layer. We are only covering the kind of abstract representation. So this would not be a wireframe. This is a final design, right? So there's too much detail, right? At this point, we want to discuss the use of different types of user interface elements. We want to discuss kind of how are we structuring the pages, how do we navigate, but we don't want to discuss color or logos or any of that. So here, maybe a representation of how that should look like. You really want to be more concrete than just having little blocks on the screen, but you definitely want to stay away from styling, right? So you really want to have this component level wireframe, and so in the middle between high resolution and low resolution. This would be a wireframe that's a bit more on the kind of low resolution side. It's a bit block level still, and this would be a wireframe which I would consider has the right kind of level of detail for such digital product design processes. As I mentioned, something that you might also want to look into is user interface elements, different kind of components for user interfaces that you can use. Here's just a brief overview of different types. There are many others. As I said, look into your organization's design system as well if there's one in place. I can recommend looking, for example, into the Google design system, into the Apple design system. There are many others, for example, of Shopify, of different organizations where you can have a look how they organize components, etc. That where you might actually take over one or the other idea if you're starting from scratch. So now we had the user flows. Okay, how do our features relate to screens and how are screens connected to each other? Then we had the wireframes, which is like the user interface of the individual screen. And what we now want to do is we want to write user stories. So if you're not acquainted with agile software development, user stories are really a short description for the software developers, of what a particular kind of feature that you have should be, right? And this is the beginning of a longer description. But see it as, if I don't describe it in a user story, it will not be tackled by any software developer, right? So if you are a digital product design person or you are involved in such a process, you need to make sure that everything in your app gets converted into a user story at some point, right? And there's a bit of a challenge around user stories. You don't want user stories that are too large. This is because of the way that agile teams work, because they will always get the biggest kind of score for effort that needs to be put into it. And you don't want to have too narrow user stories where you write many thousand user stories for a software and they all get the lowest score possible by the development team. So what you want to have is like basically a description of a feature which is large enough to become a user story, and there's some sort of normal distribution of kind of effort that needs to be put into the user story, and that they are just on the kind of left end or the right end of how many points they can get for the effort that needs to be put into them. But how do you write user stories? You describe them from a user perspective. And here is an example. So as for example, non-logged in user, I want to be able to log in or reset my password so that I can access my user data in the app, right? So you can group things together, for example, signing up and logging in, and you have to describe it for the kind of user group that you have. In most cases, I would say it will not make sense to talk about certain personas, and probably also not certain users. In most cases in software, it will be so-called roles. How is a role different? A role is, for example, if university administrators, university faculty, and university students use the same app, but they are using different parts of different sets of features. So you need to display them different things. Only use different roles if that actually changes something in your app. If it doesn't, then it's not relevant. It's not relevant whether like an older person or a younger person uses your app, unless you want to make sure that, for example, text sizes are adjusted, something like that. So think of, is it really different, or can I use the same software for different types of people? And only if it's different, then separate them. So what you can always do is that using non-logged in users and logged in users, you can have different roles. As I said, for example, a student should not be able to alter grades for other students in a software, for example, whereas a university administrator might be able to do that. Or, for example, a faculty member should be able to upload their slides to a system, etc., etc. So you see, it's only relevant if you have different sets of features. What you encourage you to is that you, in the early days, you sort of put this into a table. And what I can also recommend is maybe not only put it into a table, but maybe also give the reference to the screen that you have in your user flow. So potentially say, okay, this is screen, I don't know, 5.7a. And this is screen 5.7b. And what you can also do is you can use all these features that you have transferred into user stories at some point, and you can start thinking about prioritization, right? You can think about certain tasks and activities that users have, and then you can group them together and say, okay, this is the very first release. These are the features that we need to have. And these are maybe features that we can plan for later releases as well, to help setting priorities, because this will be one of potential your tasks as well, is to set priorities for the development team and to discuss with them which kind of user stories are more and less effort. So potentially they will not discuss it with you, but they will tell you how much effort they need to put into realizing these. All right, and then last but not least, we have the entity relationship models, and this is really the information architecture, right? We want to think of what kind of data our app uses. We want to think of how this data relates to each other, and we want to think what kind of columns each of the kind of data sets has that we want to use. And this is one example. There's a very particular notation to it. You don't need to use this notation, but it's important that you use some notation that makes clear how these relate to each other, right? And in this case, we have users that have a user ID, they have a name, they have a coach ID and a habit number in this case, and they are connected to 0 or many habits, where each habit can be connected to many users, right? And then there's a check-in connected to a habit. So 0 to many check-ins are connected to a habit, and one and only one habit is connected to each of the check-ins. And there you see, okay, each of these yellow boxes, they have these blue attributes. And if you want to think of each of these yellow boxes as a separate tab in an Excel table, right? So you have multiple of these tabs in your database, so to say. You think in columns. The blue ones then become columns. So for each of the habits, you have one row in your habits tab, and each of the kind of blue ones becomes a column. And that is the data that you want to have for every of your rows. Maybe as a quick example, and I think we slowly come to an end. As a quick example, for example, if you set up a system for booking rooms for lectures, right? And you want to potentially add a feature that includes the attendance of certain students. Let's say we have a lecture room, we have a lecture, so a certain session that is being run. This is connected to a teacher, and we have their students, right? So then you have like these 4 entities, these 4, so to say, tabs in your Excel table. And you need to make sure that you communicate how these relate to each other. So for example, each of the session can have 0 to many rooms if it can be online as well, right? And each of the sessions needs 1 to many lecturers. So there's always a responsible person that has a key and can open the doors. And each of the sessions can have 0 to many students, right? And each student can, well, obviously in the kind of database sense, be in many 0 to many of the sessions. Obviously not simultaneously, but for each of the rows of the sessions, there can be many students, right? So this is really a way to communicate how you use data and how all these kind of different elements relate to each other. A brief recap, we have user flows as an artifact. Then we have the wireframes that are basically every screen that we zoom into. We have the user stories that start off the conversation with the software developers, that describe a feature from a user perspective. And then we have entity relationship models that really display the information architecture, and that really helps later on for the software engineers to understand how things work and how they potentially can transfer this into a database design. And something that I would encourage you to do is try this out. Try these kind of, at least these 4 artifacts, these tools that I showed you today, user flows, wireframes, user stories, entity relationship model. Try this in a very simple app, right? So you have experienced firsthand how that works. And I always recommend just use a stopwatch app. That's a very simple app, but add a bit of complexity to it by saying you need at least a user login. So it needs to be multi-user capable, and it needs to have a lap function. So you, for example, if you drive a race car, you can take different lap times of your race. And with that, I think we can conclude. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Markus and me. Over to you, Markus.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for sharing all these important insights. And actually, I have some questions, if you allow, in particular, coming up with a stopwatch exercise. So maybe let's take it from there. So what do you think, maybe considering current developments in no code or low code, I'm wondering how this might even impact the design of digital products, as you maybe can change a lot of things simply, in inverted commas, on the fly or not. So what is maybe your take on that?
So I'm not sure if you have seen any of these memes on, for AI to actually develop a good software, it needs the customer to actually communicate what he wants. We are all safe. So I think one of the key challenges is to properly be able to describe what you actually want from, for example, an AI that helps you with designing something. That's one aspect, right? So, and I think the tools that we showed today, the processes that we showed today, they are methods of achieving sort of a joint understanding amongst different stakeholders of what we're actually building, right? So I think a big part of the tasks that we have as business managers in digital product design is communicating, right? We need to communicate all these ideas to the people who are involved and need to make sure that we're all on the same page. And so that's one thing. So we describe properly what we want. And only then actually all these AI tools can help us properly, right? They can help us with ideas, with suggestions, etc., etc. But if we are not able to describe what we want, it will be very hard. And the second part is all the question around low code and no code. I think there we actually have powerful tools that if we understand things like information architecture, we understand how different user interface elements work, we understand all these things that we've learned today, we can actually go relatively far in building prototypes with these tools to test our ideas early on without spending a lot of money and effort on actually software development, which obviously also is supported more and more through digital technologies like artificial intelligence, where software developers get a lot of suggestions on like optimizing their code or finding bugs, etc. Right? So I think that obviously things are changing quite quickly in this field, but if you are able as a business manager to describe properly what you want and achieve consensus in your organization on that, I think you have achieved quite a big accomplishment already.
Okay, yeah, actually this perfectly relates to my second or next question, which is from your experience, because we already mentioned at the beginning, you do these workshops, topics in different settings and frameworks, different levels, executive, bachelors. Why is the analysis and design phase still today in 2023 so much underestimated or not well performed, to put it in other words? So what do your workshop participants say? What do you observe? So because it's not a actually should be a no-brainer that if you invest in the beginning, you can prevent a lot of mistakes. So it's a little bit like in operations management, where if I can save money in the procurement process, I will lower or no, I will increase my margin directly. And same applies here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think like there's I think two main problems. One is there is sort of still people are still hesitant about just reaching out to other people and ask them, right? And they might be hesitant to run the interviews that are necessary, and they might think they know already, et cetera, right? So this putting this effort into the early stage of the design phase is crucial for understanding your customer's problem and then coming up with a fitting solution, right? So both understanding the problem and the requirements that are coming through the context, or let's take the example of an app that nursing staff uses to document the kind of health journey in a hospital of patients, right? The kind of way that a hospital works, the way that shifts work, that like the kind of constraints that the nursing staff has, the kind of conflicts that they have with different other groups in the hospital, et cetera. All this influences how you ideally build a product that does the job for them or with them, right? Which makes their life easier. So I think that's a big part of it. So doing this research, not only interviews, not only desk research, but also observations, going there, etc. And that obviously is very expensive, right? And I think especially in early phases of these kind of product developments, organizations are potentially quite hesitant about putting a lot of effort and money into these kind of research projects in the end, right? Which are not yet pointing to any kind of solution. And I think that's one of the key problems. And then we have a second problem is like we might ask people what they want, but they might not know what is actually possible, right? So we have this kind of problem on the other side as well. So there might be what we call an innovation research inchoate demand, right? So demand is not yet formulated because the innovation, the kind of new thing that we are building is not known by anyone, right? And so we can tackle and address that through bringing prototypes, through bringing like maybe even low fidelity, maybe sometimes it's a cardboard demonstrator or like a mock-up that already allows us to have some sort of interaction. But to bringing these kind of prototypes back into the discussion and making sure that like sort of people see what is possible and then feedback on that, right? So I think both sides, the kind of hesitance of like doing this early investment into user research and reaching out to people and doing observations and putting all this effort in, and then also the problem of customers to actually or users not knowing what they want, really. I think these are two key challenges.
Yeah, and maybe it's also a little bit related to culture in a very broad perspective.
Oh, absolutely.
Shared values and norms, and in particular in what you were saying about, does the customer know what he needs? So if we think about the iPhone, you mentioned it, very, very dominant or very exponential, no, very, very clearly at the beginning, so now I have the right adjective. And so yeah, if it would have been done in traditional recommendations and innovation processes in a company, maybe we would have never had it. So there was maybe really just this genius about Steve Jobs or another product developer sometimes that are really leaping much forward. And yeah, actually it also touches to what I have had as a guest lecture this week in another group, where somebody from Salesforce said that they really stopped their voice control of Salesforce development, or the advent of all the smart speakers. They invested a lot in this area and nobody is using it. So a little bit like the Star Trek, what kind of planet is ahead thing, nobody wants to use, at least in a professional environment. So that's even maybe why we have in all the GPT and AI tools at the moment prompts we have to ask, which is a little bit more closer to Googling. And on the other hand, I also have had somebody talking about future technology as in part of another webinar, who was saying maybe our kids are the current ones who still learn how to Google, but maybe this will be not the case in the next generations. So there's a lot of things going on, and all of these things are also impacting digital product design. So a fascinating topic, which will keep us fascinated in the future. Thank you very much, David, for your time.
It was a pleasure to join.
Yeah, it was a pleasure that you were with us.